and we can get started.
Do you want to leave the presenter with me, Greg, or?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, fine.
Okay, so welcome everyone to our final live webinar. It's hard to believe that this is our 5th webinar, and it's really a pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. The topic is similarities and differeces in OD and HPI, and I had an opportunity to meet Gary, I guess it was a little over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, and we had started this conversation about the connection between, I was sharing with him the contents of our course and sharing with him that, you know, we were going to be studying the connection between instructional systems development and human performance improvement, and he shared with me that a shared colleague of ours has had this ongoing discussion with him about OD and HPI and ISD. So I thought that that would be a really nice addition to our course, because oftentimes we're working with different learning professionals or development professionals, and we're not really sure what they're doing and how they complement what we do. And so the idea for sharing this connection was born, and I think that it will help to allow you, if you work in an environment where you're working with OD folks as well, or there are OD folks in your environment, you'll have a better appreciation for what they do as a result of tonight's presentation. So with that in mind, I will turn it over to tonight's speaker. Gary, welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you so much, Catherine. Yes, we've had an interesting year together, working on some projects. Okay, I'm assuming that everyone who's here is who's going to be here has access to the chat. So we'll be doing some things interactively. So we'll be using that. So let's talk a little bit about the similarities and differences. Well, here's a little bit about me. I think I'm assuming that most of you have seen something about me, but I'm just an old guy who's been interested, and I've been a student of organization development for a long time, about close to 40 years now. I've actually been in the field about 38 years, but I started this in undergraduate school, actually, and was one of the first folks to take a look at organizational systems theory. In fact, you'll see that my graduate degree is in public administration rather than business or anything else. Back when I started, you couldn't get a degree in organization development. There were no schools offering those degrees. So one of the questions that someone asked is, what did I do to get into OD? And I sort of stumbled into it because it was the process. Back in '74, we ended up the only guy who was teaching organizational systems theory on the East Coast was a guy by the name of Bob Mowitz, and he was in the political science department at Penn State, and they had made him the director of the Institute of Public Administration. So the only way that you could study with him was to go to the institute and get a degree under his program. So that's how I ended up with an MPA, but you'll see it says it's organizational systems. My first textbook in that program was a biology book. Because we were really studying organizations, and back in those days it was new science to think about organizations not as mechanical beings that you could weld together and hammer and pound and bolt into place, that you actually had to grow and develop and nurture, not unlike a living organism. And so that was new science back then. And so then you'll see the rest of my time, I've been a student a long time. So as I tell my graduate students in my other programs, we're all sort of strange ducks, because we're on a Tuesday night we're sitting here talking about organization development instead of sitting in front of the black box watching you know, Lost in Space or something. So what have you all heard about organization development? If just sort of type in anything that you've heard about OD and what it is.
So while they're typing, Gary, I'll let you know that one of the participants tonight, Patrick, said that he also has an undergraduate degree in political science.
Ah, okay, terrific. Or public administration, PA?
Public administration, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I see that. Through human resource change and satisfying moving staff, organizational effectiveness, team development, true. Just learned that we have an OD department today. They're a stealth OD department. That's interesting. Gita. Yeah, sometimes these are not organizations that fly high on the corporate mast. Yeah. Any other thoughts? We'll just continue on here. Okay. By the way, I did get everyone's questions, and we will work through them. What I'm going to try to do is get through the materials and then save some time towards the end to talk through some of these questions and try to answer them directly. So I actually spent some time today and jotted some notes on what we might want to do. So let's just dive into this and talk a little bit about what organization development is. You know, what I'm doing is I'm playing with my buttons here to make sure that I have. Okay, so let's talk about what it is. Let's talk first about the terms, the simple words. I tend to use the simplest way to think about things. Probably that's the way my mind works, and it's probably because it's not very sophisticated, so I can only handle a few things at a time. But let's talk about an organization. Let's just hear an affiliation of individuals in the pursuit of a common goal, or in the coordination of separate components into a unit or structure. So an organization, one of the things that I've often told folks is that, you know, an organization is just a group of folks trying to get something done. You know, I don't care if it's the United States Army or IBM or Ford Motor Company or the great aunts trying to figure out what the family reunion ought to look like. The organizational issues are the same. There's a bunch of individuals trying to find their way in some common goal. So if an organization is a group of folks trying to get something done, then I've got to control my push buttons here. Development is to improve or advance the condition, to progress, to get more successful. So organization development then really is the idea. My goodness, I've got to fix this button. I apologize. The folks at the Organization Development Network, I'm going to have to find another button. I'm sorry. I apologize. We just keep going to, my goodness. Okay, let's stop there. I'm not going to touch that button for a while. The organization development, by the way, one of the folks asked the question about what would be a good place to learn a little bit about organization development. You can go online, just Google Organization Development Network, and while it's a dues-based organization, they have quite a number of quite a bit of material that's free for the public that you can just get into and read about, and they've got some resources and some white papers and things that you don't have to pay for if you're interested in taking a little deeper dive into the concept of organization development. The Organization Development Network, they're online, national program. So it says here there's no single definition of organizational development. We were talking earlier. One of the things that I liken organization development to be, in terms of trying to understand the breadth and depth of it, is probably the best analogy would be the field of medicine. I mean, in the field of medicine, you can go everywhere, all the way from brain surgery and very scientific, very detailed research activities, all the way to acupuncture and ear candling and all kinds of things. And then in the fields, you've got things like podiatry or pediatrics or psychiatry. So you've got various fields, but you also have different skills: surgery, anesthesia, internal medicine, neurology. Well, in organization development, it's a lot. It's a lot like that, because what happens is that over the years, over the last 30 or 40 years, organization development has expanded into this idea that anything that has to do with organizations and trying to improve them, folks can label themselves as an organization development consultant. So so we have people in the OD field who are very scientifically based, very much involved in the research components of organizations, and we've also got folks who are in the outer edges, who, as I was joking with Catherine just the other day, I've got friends who really believe that the solution to world peace is organization development. That the thing that we want to do is to get together and we'll all talk about our issues together, and that'll make us better. So one of the things I want to talk about is that organization development is really, there is no single definition, and it's very broad and very deep. There are folks who are primarily trainers call themselves organization development consultants. Folks who are primarily leadership consultants call themselves organization development consultants. People who do surveys call themselves organization development consultant. In fact, there's a branch of organization development called survey guided development, in which you begin the process of doing the improvement work based upon a survey technology. So that's like an akin to pediatrics or podiatry, and it's a field where folks who are very skilled at surveys have used that as their entrance into this organization development. So the bottom line is organization development can then really be defined as the practice of changing people and organizations for positive growth. Okay, so let's take a little dive into some of these definitions that we're talking about. By the way, any questions or comments? Please feel free to chime in while we're talking here.
So the one advice so far, technical, we got Walter was saying that you could advance the slides by just on your keyboard, Gary, using the right arrow, and that should advance your slides, right to go forward and left to go backwards.
Well, I've got it under control. I adjusted my attention. I have a fairly sophisticated mouse, and I was playing with it the other day, and I tuned it up a little too tight, so I've got it back to normal now. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some of these definitions, and I'm going to have to, since I don't have a copy. OD, the Human Resource Management and Development Handbook. OD is a planned process of developing an organization to be more effective in accomplishing its desired goals. The ASTD, which is now ATD, the Association for Talent Development, I'm sure you're all aware of the new change from ASTD folks made this summer. Organization development practitioners help companies manage change and align people, process, and practices for success. In its simplest form, OD work aims to be a catalyst that helps the organization get from where it is today to its desired state, getting from point A to point B. The Government Office of Personnel Management says that organization development is the application of behavioral scientific principles and methods to increase an organization's effectiveness. Don't you find that it's interesting that the Government Office of Personnel Management makes a single sentence seem so complicated? I always love that definition. Well, I must have lied. I didn't get. Organization development is a management field that focuses on helping organizations to develop their full potential. Organization development is an effort planned organization-wide and managed from the top to increase an organizational effectiveness and health through planned interventions in the organization's process. Dick Beckard, who is probably, he's one of the folks who is sort of known as the father of organization development. Dick Beckard. He's passed now. He passed, golly, probably 15 years ago, Organization development, University of California says, our organization development is the field of study and practice that focuses on various aspects of organizational life, including culture, values, systems, behavior. The goal of OD is to increase organizational effectiveness and organizational health through planned interventions in the organization's process or operations. Most often, OD services are requested when an organization or a unit within an organization is undergoing a process of change. So what I'm going to ask then, golly, what common themes do you see in these definitions? I'm going to take the advice and just use the keys on the pad right now. What common themes do you see? Change management, yep. Change and increasing effectiveness, absolutely. Process orientation, leadership, absolutely. So we're seeing things that have to do with helping leaders to create and sustain effective organizations, usually through some process of change. You know, we have a throwaway line we use in the field. A friend of mine says that unless things change, they're likely to remain the same, and that's really true. He also says that unless you keep moving, even if you're on the right track, you're going to get run over. So you need to find ways to improve the organization. And so the common themes are things like change, effectiveness, and we're going to talk about what that means in a second. In fact, for a long time, there was a debate on whether it should be organization development or organization effectiveness. In fact, my time in the Army as an organization development, I was a civilian working in the Army for various commands on organization development issues. They actually called it organizational effectiveness. My official title was Organizational Effectiveness Staff Officer, which I always thought was intriguing because I'd never been in the military. And it has to do with leadership. I think Patty says that you know, certainly there's a true leadership component there. And one of the things we're going to talk about is that as we do these things, we really need to think about where the leader's position is in these things. And we're going to talk about leaders in a different way. It doesn't always mean that you have to have the president of the company. You can get stuff done down in the bowels of the organization if you can find the leaders of the places that you're actually working. Okay, so let's any thoughts, ideas, questions as we move forward here. Again, we're going to be taking not a terribly deep dive because I want to get into the discussions here in a little bit. But anything else? I see no movement.
Patty says
OD makes me nervous in my organization. Patty, could you talk a little bit more about that? I don't know if we can, whether we can. We don't have it. Okay. Is there a way to? I'm really curious. Is there a way to unmute Patty to have a chance to talk with a little bit about that?
We should be able to.
County Public Ed hires and fires. Hang on.
I don't know if maybe Greg, if you're on the line, are you able to unmute Patty's line? Maybe he's not with us. Oh, there it is. I just saw it unmuted. Patty, you wanna? Your line should be open. Do you wanna? Oh, she said, "Hang on."
Yeah, we're here now.
All right.
I'm not trying to be facetious, but it certainly. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not trying to be sarcastic or facetious, so to speak, but it definitely seems in my organization that there is not any organizational development. It certainly seems to me that human resources is only there to barely support or to hire and fire, and that's all it seems. And even our own training and professional development doesn't even fall under the umbrella of human resources. It's a whole other sector in our organization.
And they probably focus on technical training primarily.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
But that's not under human resources. That falls under IT.
Right, right. That's Patty. That's not an unusual scenario. There are very few organizations that actually have OD as a separate standalone activity. Oftentimes they'll put it in trainings, or they'll not have it at all. I mean, there's an old throwaway line that we use. We talk about the fact that people who don't need OD generally ask for the help, and the folks who need it the most don't ask.
Oh.
So I mean, it's that old line. You know, they don't know what they don't know, and they don't know whether they need it. So part of the time, many times we find organizations that don't have any kind of official OD. In fact, there's a history in my career where when I came to Florida and went to work for a large insurance company here, there were two vice presidents of organization development, one on the public side that handled the Medicare stuff, and one on the private side. And there were 12 OD consultants on staff. Within 10 years, when that president retired, within 10 years we were down to 2 OD staff. And when I left 5 years later, I actually had bailed from the OD field and gone to work directly for a vice president in marketing in order to be able to do OD work, because the human resource department decided to kill organization development because they didn't think it was a needed effort. And so you can see in just the course of 15 years in a large organization, you could go from being widely popular to not existing. And I'm told recently they've just decided to start hiring OD folks again because they found out they need them. So there is that ebb and flow in various organizations, and whoever wrote leadership earlier on, absolutely, it's a function of the leadership and whether or not OD programs tend to exist or not. So,
thank
terrific. You. Okay. Any other common themes? Thank you for that comment. That was really helpful. Yes. Okay. Well, let's talk then a little bit about what we've talked about. There's one of the things that we want to talk about here, and it's the idea of organizational systems theory. One of the key elements of organization development is recognizing that organizations are comprised of various components or systems, and all of the organizations exist in an open system themselves. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with organizational systems theory or open systems theory, but at the base it's very simple. It said that an organization is a system, and we're going to talk about that in more detail in a second, but it gets inputs, and then there are outputs, and then there's a feedback loop, and that all happens in an environment. So there are some key points that I wanted to share with you about this whole idea of general systems theory. The first one is that the notion of a system as a set of interrelated subsystems, and I'm going to show you some models here in a second of how we might think about those interrelated subsystems. And this is a defining concept of any system, and it captures the idea that the behavior of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That's a key component of organization development, that the behavior of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so we're going to talk about, go ahead.
Pause for a second on that.
Sure.
Okay. And then Walter writes, AKA synergies.
Absolutely, absolutely. That the whole idea of synergy, exactly.
And Patty writes, this reminds me of software programming training.
Well, there is some akin to that. I'm not sure exactly. Certainly, from a systems perspective, absolutely. Other thoughts and synergies. So a second characteristic of systems theory is the concept of an open system. Closed systems are characterized by a greater degree of certainty because they have no ability to import energy from the environment to counteract the buildup of entropy, which is what the second characteristic is. Open systems can import energy from their environment and therefore can grow and change over time. So those inputs in a closed system For example, a closed system would be a internal combustion engine. It's all set up and it works. And if you throw water in the intake manifold, it's probably not going to work too well anymore. Whereas an open system would find a way to adapt to that. The third principle is something called input transformation and output process, which is what this little symbol on the bottom of the page talks about. It's a constant process of taking inputs and transforming them into outputs. The inputs are acquired from the environment, and the output goes back into the environment in a constant exchange. For example, a business firm might import such things as raw materials and labor, transforms them into goods and services, and delivers these outputs to its customers. And suppliers and customers are part of this external environment. The fourth thing I want to talk a little bit about in this little model is the idea of feedback. The bottom word, or the bottom box there, feedback. It's the note. Feedback is what allows a system to attain its steady state. It sort of helps it stay in balance. There are two types of feedback loops. The first is called negative, or error control, and it's information on which the system reacts in one that's after the fact or after the error has occurred. So you find out that you're going too fast, or you're going too slow, or you're going to the right or to the left. You make those adjustments. That's negative feedback. And then the system uses information on small errors to take corrective action. The other is called feed-forward control, and it's anticipatory in nature. The system anticipates what might occur and takes corrective action before the disturbances can affect the system. So you see there's the feedback. Actually, sometimes this is called cybernetics, from the Greek kyber, which means to steer. So the whole idea of cybernetics in organization development is the idea of making clear how you steer. Think about it as the rudder on the organization that steers it in the right direction, using the feedback from the environment on whether or not it's going to the right or left, or up or down, however that is. Another concept that I want to share with you on this open systems theory, which is important to organization development consultants, is this idea of homeostasis. You've probably heard about that. It refers to the ability of a system to achieve a state of dynamic equilibrium. What we're talking about is the environment in which the organization exists is changing, and therefore the organization should change, but the changes would be enough to meet the environmental changes. Homeostasis is that whole concept that comes from a body at rest stays at rest, the body at motion moves in motions with the third law of of fluid dynamics, or I'm not sure which. It's the third law of some dynamic. Anybody remember what that is? But it's the whole idea that homeostasis means that the organization fights to stay in equilibrium. It fights to stay in balance. So we had talked earlier about the idea that organization development brings change into the system, and it's about making improvements. Any improvement requires you to change. I mean, conceptually, that idea that improvement creates the conflict from change, and so the whole system tries to stay in equilibrium. So one of the things we have to deal with in organization development is that whenever we begin to create changes in an organization, the whole system fights to stay and keep from moving. It's sort of like a gyroscope. It doesn't want to correct course. It doesn't want to change course, and it's a key component that organization development consultants have to deal with, in that the whole system just fights to stay as is. And then there's the very last thing.
Gary Walter has written that death equals stasis.
Right. Oh, yeah, exactly. That's good. Yeah, the whole idea of homeostasis really means that that it wants to stay right where it is, and sometimes, as I said earlier, even if you're on the right track, you're going to get run over if you just sit there. So equifinality, the last one, the final principle, it's defined as the ability of a system to attain the same final result from many different initial conditions. That is, systems exhibit a many-one behavior on which the system can find the same end state from many different initial starting positions. So the idea of equifinality means that you don't have to be in one place to get to where you want to go. So it reminds me of an old when I used to coach softball. We were lost one time up in the hills of Kentucky, and we were looking for a place, and we drove into this little old gas station, and the guy said, I asked where the ball fields were, and he said, well, you go down, no, let's see, you go down to the corner, no, you can't get there from here. He had, in his mind, he had to take me to a place, so he said, well, I have to take you to a place that I know. So he gave me directions to a place that he knew, and then he gave me directions to where the ball fields were. So you could start in any place and still get there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of these models. The perfect equilibrium, exactly. That's funny. So let's talk. I'm wondering why. There it is. We're going to talk first about the McKinsey 7S model. Now, McKinsey is a consulting firm. They've been around for many, many years. The McKinsey Consulting, and they came up with a number of years ago this idea of, they call it the 7S model. It's a simple model that allows you to think about the various components and substructures that exist inside of an organization. So you see the three red ones tend to be more around strategy, structure, and systems. Those tend to be sort of the hardwired things. And then you've got the skills, shared values, style, and staff tend to be the more human-based components of the organization. So let's talk a little bit about what these are. Let's talk about strategy first. And that's the direction and scope of the company over the long haul, over the long term. So it's where they want to go, okay? The structure, that's the basic organization of the company, its departments, its reporting lines, its areas of expertise, and its responsibilities, and how they're interrelated. So the structure, you know, one of the things that I also want to share with you all as you're thinking about this stuff is that organization, many of us think about an organizational chart when we hear the word organization. I would like to dissuade you from doing that from now on, because really an organization chart is really a responsibility chart or an accountability chart. I think if you think about it, you realize that no work actually gets done along the flow lines of an organization chart. So when we talk about structure, we're not talking about the organization chart alone. We're talking about all the interrelated areas of expertise and responsibility, and how work flows, and how things actually get done. Not the way they get, even the way they get done on paper, but the way they actually get done. Then we talk about systems. Formal and informal procedures that govern everyday activity, covering everything from management information systems through to the systems at the point of contact with the customer, the retail systems, the call center systems, the online systems, and so on. So those are sort of the lifeline and the I guess if we were going to use the human body, it would be the systems are the things that are like our nervous system and the way we send messages from different body parts. That's the kinds of things. It's those lifelines that hold it together. And then we've got the skills, the capabilities and competencies that exist within the company, what it does best. Those are the skills that you would want to look at. And then there are shared values, the values and beliefs of the company. Ultimately, shared values guide employees towards something that is a valued behavior. And then you've got the staff, the company's people resources and how they are developed, trained, and motivated. And then you've got the style, and the style is the leadership approach of the top management and the company's overall operating approach. And as you think about it, you probably can think about the various differences in companies. You know, if you were at Google, the things in this 7S model would look very different than if you were at Hewlett-Packard or at Ford. And so the style's different, the values are different, the skills are different. So, but yet these models, what they allow us to do as organization development consultants is to make sure that we cover all the bases. That's the essence, that's the utility of these models that I'm going to share with you, this one and the next couple. They allow us to focus on all of the things and the interrelated parts of an organization when you begin to create change. Because, you know, organizations are a lot like a big old marshmallow. When you push on one spot, it pops out someplace else. And you've got to have some idea of if you change the strategy, then that's going to affect your skill base, your styles, your shared values. If you change your systems, that's going to impact all these other things. So what happens is when you begin to think about organization development, you need to begin to think about all of these subsystems that exist inside of an organization. Here's another model that's a little easier, and it's the one that I tend to use mostly, and it's from Kasten Rosenzweig. They originally put this material together way back in 1979. Probably most of you weren't even born then, but it was back before there was an OD program. This is the idea of systems approach, systems thinking, and they said, you know, there's things that go on inside of an organization. There are goals and values, there's technical accountabilities, there's social political components, there's the structure and the organization, and you put all those together, and where they overlap, and that's the idea of this Venn diagram, is where all these things overlap is where the leadership fits. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Ed Deming from the quality movement in the country, and he's the guy who turned Japan around. You know, when all of this came out around total quality and things like Six Sigma and all of the things, he was really upset because he believed that all of this stuff was simply management. This is stuff that you should be doing that was really leadership, and so he was not a big proponent of things like you know, the quality is job one and all those slogans and phrases. In fact, his 14 points, he says to get rid of all those slogans and phrases. So again, it has to do with the idea of goals and values and technical. And let's look at another one. Yeah, you study it in college. So yes, exactly. Kaizen. Yep. Those are the. I think, as you saw in my bio, I'm a black belt in quality. So sometimes I make those connections. Here's one that comes from colleagues of mine, Warner Burke, you may have heard of him, and George Litwin. These are two sort of famous in the field organization development consultants. Warner Burke is at Columbia, and he's well known. He does a lot of work in organization development. And George Litwin's out of England, Britain somewhere. That's hence the spelling of organizational. It's not a that's the British spelling. But they put together this idea, and again, look at the ideas. You've got inside of down at the very bottom. I don't know if you can see my cursor moving, but the individual and organizational performance is the outline. That's where everything ends up inside this environment. This is what you want: individual and organizational performance. But how you get there is to take a look at everything from the external environment to leadership to mission to structure to management practices to policies and procedures to the work unit climate, motivation. Again, a model to use to just guide your thinking, and that's what these models are for. They're used to guide your thinking and say, these are all the things that are important when you begin to examine an organizational issue. Okay? Any questions so far? I'm going to stop there, and if there's any questions, then I'm going to tell you a little story about an actual case in point. Anything? Catherine, I never know quite how long to wait.
No, it's you know, it takes people time to think and then to type. So
right. That's why I'm.
Okay. I guess I have a question, Gary. These different models that you've shared, you shared the one that you prefer to use. Do you use different models in different environments? Do you find that the model that you choose to use you can use in different environments like government or private sector or nonprofits?
Yes, and that's a great question, because I don't know that in 38 years I've ever shared a model with a client.
Okay.
These are sort of internal thought processes that we use. I mean, because if you were to go into a client and throw that in front of them, they would ask you to leave. Most of my clients, anyway, because they would say that's just way too complicated. So one of the things that I would say is that these are tools to help us think through those, and you need to work on them, and you need to share pieces of it as you work through with the client. But I'm going to show you a very simple model that I use with the client that takes all of this into consideration. But in a minute, I'm going to share the APIE model, which is the one that I do share with the client, and it's a very simple, very logical approach. So that's part of the answer. The other part is it depends on the sophistication of the issue and where we're working. I tend to use the simpler models because you can tend to get drawn into the detail of some of these. And sometimes, if the work unit climate is fine, I mean everybody's doing just fine, you don't really need to spend a lot of time on that. Or if the structure is not an issue, then you don't need to spend a lot of time on that. And so I don't know if that answers the question, Catherine, but the various models all have the key components in common. There's leadership or management practices. There is the organizational structure. There is the culture of the organization. There is, and I've only shared, very honestly, I've shared with 3 or 4 of these. Mm-hmm. There are dozens. I mean, almost every major consultant has their own model, but they all tend to say the same thing. It's sort of like, in group dynamics, there are last count there were 101 group dynamics models. All of them are based around forming, storming, norming, performing, and a journey. So they're all. I don't know. Say more. But in organizations where change occurs with appointments, do they all begin from scratch again? Patty, I think the question there. Well, let's finish. Hold that. Let's finish with Catherine. Did we get?
Oh yeah, no, Gary, I was really glad you shared that this is an internal process. I made a huge mistake after the first ISPI conference to come back and share these models with my boss, and she was totally overwhelmed with them. And she said, "All right, can you pick one that you like working with and use it?" But it was one of those things where we're not going to discuss this again, but you're welcome to use one of these. So I'm glad you offered that distinction.
Yeah, these would be sort of like the operating manuals for an operating system, or a manual that a mechanic might use tearing down your transmission. They don't come and show you the whole diagram of the transmission being tore down and which gear has to come out first. They might just show you an overview and say, okay, we're going to have to replace all these parts. So yes. And now, Patty, the idea of organizations where change occurs with appointments, do they all begin from scratch again? That's one of the reasons we generally don't share, unless there's someone who's very sophisticated in a leadership position, who really is sort of a closet OD person, which I've had some of those. I actually have had. I had a 4-star general I worked with in the Army who was very familiar with a lot of these models and a lot of this work. And so for them, we did go into the detail of the models and work through them and design how we were going to attack each component of the organizational system. And he liked the McKinsey model, so we use that as one. And so if you have someone who likes those and brings it to you, certainly we would use that. And you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the issues you have with appointments and with change, You know, we talk about whenever a leader leaves an organization, all of the cultural and the group dynamics go back to zero. And unless you have a very strong set of processes in place to keep it running, you will end up having to rework it. Well, that was my story about OD and the company that I worked with. The one CEO left and another one came in, and you know, even the idea of doing OD work got a different level of support. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's scratched necessarily, but yes, because this stuff is so driven by and I don't mean that it has to be completely driven by the leader, but we're going to talk about it in a second. But well, I'll say it now. You don't have to have in OD work. You don't have to have necessarily the CEO 100% behind you, or in the government, you know, to have the SES or the undersecretary and 100%. There's sort of three levels of support that you can have. There's those folks who make it happen, those folks who let it happen, and those folks who try to keep it from happening. If you have at least the first two, if you at the very top, if they'll let it happen or if they'll try to help make it happen, and you're working somewhere down in the bowels of the organization, the leadership we're talking about is the people that you can impact. So that if you're a leader who can impact only 10 people, you can do OD work. I mean, if you're a division chief or a branch manager, you can do OD work. I've done really wonderful and satisfying OD work with folks who were branch managers that had, you know, 30 folks, because they had someone above who either was just sort of let it happen or was in support of it. In most cases, where they were in support of it, but they at least let it happen. And so, you know, you can work with a branch manager with only 30 or 50 or 100 folks, and you can get some really good work done. And you don't have to have the entire organization. So when you're thinking about an organization here, remember, you don't have to take on all of Ford at once. You can take on the the seat covering component of the of the assembly line, if you will, if that's the place that invites you in to begin to do some work. So does that make sense to everybody? Sometimes I make great sense to myself, but never anybody else. Okay. Well, let's move on then. I'm going to talk very quickly, and we're getting close to, my goodness, we're getting close to the end here. I've got to move fast. This large insurance company wanted to improve customer service, and they had a long wait for customers. They had callback requirements. They had increasing customer complaints. They had disgruntled employees, and so they just said, you know, we've got to do something. So I'm going to walk you through a quick model that I shared, that I said we were going to do. It's called the APIE approach: assessment, plan, implement, evaluate. This is a model that I've been using literally since 1981. I've yet to have it fail, and it's really simple. And you're going to see in a second, it looks a lot like the HPT model, because they both come from the action research field. They're really action research models, where you begin at the beginning, the assessment. And what do you do with the assessment? You might do surveys or interviews, either group or individual. You might do observations. You might go and actually watch what's going on. You might do historical records. You can do things like complaints or issues that they've had, where they've had historical records of the issues. And the whole point of the assessment, both here and as you'll see in a second, HPT, is where we are versus where we want to be. That's what the assessment's about. And where we are is really important. A lot of folks focus on where we want to be, but it's real important to know where you are. And the metaphor that I use for that, gang, is, you know, if you want to get to San Francisco, it's really important to know whether you're in Las Vegas or Honolulu, because the way you get there is going to be different. The options you have to get there. So you really need to know where you are when you start, and you need to know where are these various components we've talked about in terms of the ability of folks to be able to make changes. So we do the assessments, And I'll talk to you about what we found in the survey when we did this in a second. The next thing is the plan. This is where you do the gap analysis. You do the intervention design. You identify what available resources you have, what dependencies and interdependencies there are in those various systems we've talked about. Are there any prerequisites that need to be in place that you have to think about if you're going to be making some changes? So you see, you do the assessment, then you figure out what you're going to do, and then you do it. I mean, it's sort of the Nike approach. You just, okay, we've said we're going to do this, we're going to do it, and then we evaluate it, and we decide whether we're improved, whether the goal was reached, and we then say, okay, if we're not where we really wanted to be, but we're in the right direction, then we go back in and we do another assessment. And so this is an iterative approach. We say, okay, it's like that whole quick story. If you're in Washington and you want to be in Los Angeles, and you decide you're going to do it by car, and you get your resources, and you know how much gas it's going to take, and where you're going to sleep, and you've got all the plans made, and you start out, and you figure it's going to take 4 days to get there, and you drive for 4 days, and you get out of the car and look around. That's the evaluation, and you see, a giant arch and the Mississippi River. Well, you're west, but you're not in Los Angeles yet. So you go back into the assessment and say, okay, now how do I get from St. Louis to Los Angeles, which is where we really want to be? And so that happens a lot in organizations. You don't get it all, and you often don't get it in one fell swoop. Oftentimes it takes iterative approaches to get things done. Okay. Let me see. Any questions on that one? So let me tell you what we did in the solution in the case in this large insurance company. They had all these problems, and they started off by saying, okay, let's do customer service training, because the biggest issue was customer service problems. We had long line waits and problems. But here's the metaphor that I use. It's sort of like this. We found that we wanted to, the training was akin to wanting to paint the room, but we found out that the wallpaper wouldn't hold the paint, so we took the wallpaper down and found out that the plaster was bad. We took the plaster down and found out that the studs were bad, and we ended up literally having to completely redesign. And so what happens with OD sometimes is if you just throw training at it, or you just throw a new system at it, you often don't hit it, because the issues are sometimes hidden behind the walls. In this case, we found, for example, that there were 7 different computer systems that the customer service rep had to use. Oftentimes they had to log out of one system and go into another one just to get the data. And so they had they often were telling customers that they had to call them back because it would take them a half an hour to find the information, and so on and so on and so on. So the short answer to that issue was they ended up going out and getting a huge new technology. It cost them $25 or $30 million a new computer system. They did a new customer management system. They trained folks on it, and they completely re-engineered the workflow. That all came from a request, can we just do some customer service training? Because what they found was the solution was bigger than that, and that often happens with OD folks. Okay, we've only got a few minutes, but I want to talk about obviously I'm a OD guy, so I don't want to give a short shift to the HPI stuff. Human performance technology. It's a systematic approach to improving productivity and competence, uses a set of methods and procedures. It's a strategy for solving problems, for realizing opportunities related to the performance of people. It's a process of selection, analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation to most cost-effectively influence human behavior. It's a systematic combination of 3 fundamental processes: performance analysis, causal analysis, intervention selection, and it can be applied to individuals, small groups, and large organizations. That all comes from the International Society for Performance Improvement. Pershing suggests it's a systematic approach to improving individual and organizational performance. HPT, human, the individuals and groups that make up our organizations, performance, activities and measurable outcomes, technology, a systematic and systemic approach to solve practical problems. That's from FEMA. And then the Handbook of Human Performance Technology says that human performance technology is the study and ethical practice of improving productivity in organizations by designing and developing effective interventions that are results-oriented, comprehensive, and systemic. So the question, what are some common themes do you see in those definitions? Excuse me. Did I put you all to sleep?
There you go. Gina says systems approach.
Systems approach, absolutely, Gina. There's a systems thought there. Would you say that another theme might be that it's people-based?
That was the next thing she said, people-centered.
People-centered. There you go. Oh, okay. All I need to do is scroll down. More individualistic, yes. Patrick says more individualistic. Yes, it is more individualistic. Yeah, for the sake of time and moving forward, and you're all right on. The difference and the similarities have to do with the focus. Where OD tends to be more organizational and larger, and that's where I always tease. We started off by saying I tease my colleague who's in ISD. We see it from OD. We start with the sort of the whole universe becomes where you start, and in HPT it tends to be primarily aimed at our the questions of human performance, thus HPT. So let's look at a couple of models. Human performance based, exactly, Melissa. So we've got some of the same stuff. We do an analysis. We've got the HPI model from this is ASTD stuff. There's a performance analysis. That's the performance state. And then you take a look at the cause. Is it knowledge, motives, physical, structure, information, wellness? And then we select a solution. But you'll see that they tend to focus in the HPI model more around the human side. These are human causes primarily. You don't see a lot of stuff in here on organizational systems, or you don't see stuff on the environment, although you'll see a little bit. And then you do the solution implementation. So you see the APIE model wrapped in here too. Do the analysis, do the plan, do the implementation, do the evaluation. So you'll see that model is very similar in that respect. Let's look at another model. Whoops. The ASPIE HPT model, where again, performance analysis and the need for the opportunity, and you look for the desired performance and the actual performance, and you'll get a gap, and you look at the analysis is the vision, mission, workplace, workflow. Again, focused primarily on individuals and the individual worker, and then you'll identify the interventions, and then you do the implementation, and then you do the evaluation. So again, you'll see that APIE model and that natural flow of what are we trying to accomplish, what do we want folks to do, but it tends to be focused more around people. So the way I think about it, and I'll just share my thinking on this. Both are aimed at improving the performance of people in organizations. The differences are in practice, style, and focus. OD is the field of study and practice that focused on various aspects of organizational life, including culture, values, systems, behavior, and has all, takes that larger look. Where HPI or HPT, the field of study and practice that focuses on improving productivity and competence, primarily for realizing opportunities related to the performance of people. So while an OD intervention might find that the solution is in the systemic nature of the communications flow, HPI might find that, but they would focus it more on the communications flow between individuals as necessarily between component parts of the organization. So the whole idea that systemic interaction of people is a key common element is really important for you all. I think we're going to pass on that, and I want to just go to questions, because we're about out of time, and I want to make sure that we have anything. And one of the things I can do is sort of answer some of the questions y'all sent in for me, or we can just take questions. What's your thinking? We've got about 4 or 5 minutes, I think, by my clock.
Gary, the session goes till 8:30, so you can take.
Oh, it goes to 8:30?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it went till 8 o'clock. I'm hurrying for no reason. I'm sorry. Well, good. We have a lot of time to talk about good stuff. So let me make sure that I didn't run too quickly over the HPI stuff, because I wanted to get to these questions, because I think a lot of that stuff that we're talking about comes from these questions and the comments and the discussion we can have on that. But if there's anything you want to talk about around HPI specifically, please let me know. Why did I think we stopped at 8?
That's okay. We've taken a deep dive this semester, so for me the most important part with this topic, since it's our last webinar, is giving people a taste for the connection between HPI and OD. So they've seen a lot of these models, and just as you shared a variety of different OD models, we've looked at a variety of different HPI models this semester.
That's
so
terrific.
What I think would really be helpful, since we do have time, is to just go through some of the questions, and if you'd like at the end to do the case study, we have time for that. But I don't know if you're able to pull up the questions that people have in the document that I sent to you.
I have them in front of me. I can probably pull them up and put them on the screen. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, you can do that. That'd be great, Gary.
Why don't we do that? If y'all don't mind watching my. Well, first let's ask the folks. Is that something that just sort of a heads up, yes or no, that makes more sense to you to spend time on those questions? Is that where folks want to go?
So Mary says yes. Sounds good to me.
Okay. Well, let me do this. Hold on. I'm going to have to go find the questions.
I can resend them to you, Gary, if it.
No, I'm sure they're here. As long as you all don't mind looking at my inbox. Where are you? Here we are. Student questions. There we are. You all see them?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, good. Okay, so Mary asked, it seems that there are a lot of ways and approaches to improve organizations. Why did I choose OD? Actually, Mary, I didn't choose OD. OD chose me. I actually got into this. I actually got into this work long before you could get a degree in organization development. Long before there were any formal classes even being taught on it. I got into it through the study of organizational systems theory, and sort of moved into OD. And my very first job out of graduate school happened to be with a consulting firm that was housed and it was located in State College, where Penn State is, and they hired me out of graduate school to do some research work with them, and I spent 5 years then running around the country working with organizations, and primarily from an expert mode. Our firm focused on a lot of human performance technology stuff, a lot of management behavior. And it wasn't until 1981 when I went to the Organizational Effectiveness Center in Monterey where I really got focused on doing organization development from a process perspective, where instead of coming in like a lawyer or an accountant or a doctor telling folks what to do, we began to work with them on helping them to make their own choices, helping them to use their own data, doing a lot of feedback, doing things like survey-guided development, where you would survey an organization and take that data and say, okay, what are the issues that we now need to work with in order to get you from where you want to be to where you want to go. So it was never really a conscious choice. And what's intriguing about this is that a lot of my colleagues, at least of my era, have sort of the same stories. They got into it sometimes through training, sometimes they got into it through counseling. And what they found is, remember I said that it's a very broad spectrum of practitioners, and so I've got folks friends of mine who are OD consultants who tend to do a lot of leadership development and a lot of leadership, and they do a lot of surveys, and they tend to work from a survey guided approach. I've got others who tend to be more focused on doing individual assessments and doing things like 360 work with leaders. And all of that is OD work of some sort. So when you say OD, it's sort of that broad spectrum. I'm probably one of the few rare ducks who tends to run the entire spectrum. And because of, I guess partly because I've been doing it for so long, I've had an opportunity and been blessed with a lot of different approaches. So I don't know if that exactly helps, but the second question is, what does an OD professional do in a high-performing, healthy organization? Well, my first response to that is, if it ain't broke, improve it. There is always something that you can do to, I often talk to folks about, for example, the definition of a problem. Sometimes folks get confused about when they say problem, they get all sort of stoked up, and they get a lot of stress happens, a lot of concern comes to the surface. And I always talk about a problem as simply being a condition that you would like to change, and the metaphor that I use for that is that if you're an Olympic runner and you run the 100 meters in 10.2, that's pretty fast. 10.2 seconds to do 100 meters, that's Olympic time. But you want to do it in 10.1. You want to take 100. You want to take a tenth of a second off your time. Then you've got a problem. You've got a condition that you want to change. So if you're a high-performing, healthy organization, and you just want to take your customer service level up by 3 points, then you've got room for OD work, because there's things that you can do to take that up by 3 points. You can begin to engage folks in how to do that. In a healthy, high-performing organization, it's generally a lot of fun to do OD work, in my view, because what you're able to do is to engage folks, because truly an organization that's doing well, they're fun to work in because they're trying to find a way to get a little better. So I don't know. I hope that helps. I could probably do an hour dialogue on each one of these questions. So I'll just try to keep it straightforward. What are some of the factors that determine whether you use an OD or an HPI approach? Well, I think we probably answered a lot of that tonight in our discussion, but certainly the factors have to do with how broad the issue is, how much change is really going on. That's a big piece. How much leadership requirement there's going to be, how much engagement you're going to require from the organization to get buy-in to the change. All of those, for me, affect whether or not I would use more of an HPI, which tends to improve the performance of the individuals, as opposed to having to completely rewire. We often talk about OD work as the akin to rewiring the 747 while it's in flight. You have to keep everything running, and you're touching all kinds of things that could make the plane go down in a heartbeat, and so you have to be focused on that at all times. So you can't just sort of one-off anything. Do you find one or the other approach more comprehensive than the other? Well, I've obviously got an OD bias. So I'm probably not a good person to answer that, but they're different focus. And to answer this, and probably part of the other question, the assessment work that you do up front really will help you to decide which is the better approach. The assessments are so important. You know, and an assessment means that you go into the organization and I, you know, sort of the line that I like to use is you go in and you listen to the organization as if you don't already know the answer. Because, you know, I actually turned down a job one time because there was a consulting firm, an OD consulting firm, actually here in Florida, were looking for consultants, but what they were really looking for was folks who would go out and find the problem that their solution would match. And true OD is not that. True OD is not saying, okay, I know everything there is to know about, you know, the 7 habits of highly performing or high-performing people, or highly effective folks, or whatever that's the phrase. And everything matches that. True OD really begins with the assessment and saying, okay, what will work better? And if an HPI approach will give you the effectiveness you need because you really have a human performance issue, then that's the direction you should go. And any OD person worth their salt will tell you that. Okay, do you have a preferred OD model, or is it situational? I think I've answered a little bit of that, but it's situational in the sense that it depends on how comprehensive the change is. The OD model that I said that I use, that I generally start with, that I carry around in my head, is the APIE, Assessment, Plan, Implement, Evaluate. And then underneath that, in the assessment phase, is where all those various other models that we talked about fit for me. And so I want to go in and I want to take a look at the 7 systems, to use McKenzie's model, and say, okay, I want to see what are the values, what are the systems, what are the skill sets, and how do those interact, and what it is we're trying to do based upon, remember, the assessment begins to set the gap on where you are versus where you want to be. And so depending on where you are versus where you want to be, if it's something as simple as, you know, I want folks to communicate, well, it's not simple, but if you want folks to be able to communicate more effectively, there might be some key components of that system, of the organizational systems, that you would want to focus on more than others. So that all comes from the assessment. So it is situational, but I tend to like the McKenzie model personally. And well, I actually, the 3 that I threw up in front of you all, I put in front of you all, are the ones that I tend to go to when I'm trying to think through. Again, as we had that conversation, they're really thought leaders. They're checklists to make sure that we cover all the things that we need to cover. How do I view the relationship? It's symbiotic. It absolutely is symbiotic. I think we need to do that both. Okay, Melissa says, although OD and HPI are aimed at improving the performance of people in organizations, have I found one approach is better when the organization is undergoing a change in process, procedure in comparison to improving the performance. For example, they're changing the practice of manually documenting records to utilizing a database to enter the documentation versus improving a sales team's closing ratios. So one has to do with changing a lot of systems, a lot of things that are going to impact people directly, and it's not just relearning a new way to, not just relearning a way to do something or finding a new skill. So if I found one approach is better when they're undergoing a change. And I think, and again, I have a bias, but I think that the organization development thought process tends to be more comprehensive around change because, as I said earlier, if you think of an organization as a giant marshmallow, when you push on one part of it, it's going to pop out someplace else. And so one of the things that I think that OD allows us to do is to keep the whole organization in focus. And so when we begin to get folks, you know, one of the things I share with clients sometimes is, you know, it's one thing to get folks real excited about, you know, going out and digging a ditch and getting them to see the need for the organization to dig that ditch. and you really are really get folks excited, and you get them involved in the plans, and when it's time to perform, you hand them a teaspoon in order to dig the ditch. All of your work goes down the tubes, because unless you've taken a look at what systems you have in place that are going to allow people to be involved and engaged, then you've missed it. So that's one of the reasons I like to work in OD, because it requires us to think across the entire board. And things like performance appraisals, it can be pretty mundane. But if you're talking about wanting a team-based organization and team, but your performance appraisal system is based upon your individual performance at the end of the year, I'm basically saying, hey, listen, if I help her, she's going to get a better score than me. That means she's going to make more money than I do, because way too many performance appraisal systems are tied to money. So you don't get really a good picture, because and if you're trying to make performance improvements by team-based organizations, and yet you do assessments based on an individual performance appraisal system, you're fighting against yourself. And so those are the kinds of things that I would look at. So in major change, I would go after OD. Okay, I'm talking a lot here, but I'm not sure I'm making any sense of that whatsoever. What made me to decide to pursue a career in organization? Well, in organization development. Well, actually, there wasn't a whole lot of HPI stuff. It was all human resources back then. There wasn't a lot of HPI involved. But what kept me there was it's because I see these as so overlapping that it's almost not a fair discussion, because it's really a focus. I use as much human performance improvement technology as I do OD technology, depending on the situation. So, so I think both are necessary. What makes an organization effective? Walter, what makes an organization effective is if they're doing what they intend to do, and the members of the organization are healthy, happy, and excited to be there every day. And by the way, organizations can be families, and so that same bias holds for families and social groups. If they're doing what it is that they intend to do, and everybody's happy and excited about it, then they're pretty effective. Our common themes. I actually thought about that for a second, and the one that occurred to me first was communications. I like to say that if you walk into any organization anywhere in the world and you ask for the top 3 issues that they're dealing with, one of those top 3 will be communications. Communications just is a problem all the time. I like to say, for example, when you're sending out a message to folks, if it can be misinterpreted, it will be. And so it becomes very important to focus on communications. And communications is such a sophisticated issue. I mean, I tell my other students that you cannot not communicate. I mean, not answering an email sends a message. Not showing up at a meeting sends a message. So sometimes you're always sending a message. So the question is, are you sending the one that you want to? So I would think that one of the first common theme that I would talk about would be, communications. Another in today's environment is conflict management. I think that's a key process that organizations don't do a very good job, especially organizations that are trying to change, because change by its very nature creates conflict. You can't have improvement without having conflict. If you define conflict as I do, and that is one idea simply trying to occupy the space of another. So, I want to go to McDonald's and you want to go to Burger King. Well, while we both want to eat, the conflict comes from the choice of locations, and so we've got two ideas trying to occupy the same space. And so that becomes a conflict, and unless we know how to do that. So organizations, I've been in C-suites where those kinds of conversations have. Everybody wants to improve, but folks have different approaches and different ways of trying to make it happen. You know, the finance guy wants to cut, and the OD guy wants to train and or develop, and the president wants to make sure that the stockholders are happy, and so what we have is often those conflicts that come from sincere and genuine desire to do the right thing, but different approaches. So another one that's a common theme would be certainly conflict management. So I found that organizations are reluctant to implement OD. How do you sell the importance of having a well-defined set of organizational goals matched by appropriate org structure? Well, first of all, you can't sell it. One of the key concepts of OD, in my view, Walter, is that you've got to make sure that these concepts always belong to the client. Our job as OD consultants are only to help these folks think through their issues and provide them with trusted counsel. I define consulting as trusted counsel, and so if you know, at the end of the road or the end of the day, they have to live with their decisions. And so I've never tried to sell anything. Now, do I believe that there's an importance in having a well-defined set of organizational goals? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, Alice in Wonderland taught us, if it didn't teach us anything, it taught us that, you know, any road will get you there if you don't know where you're going. I mean, that was the issue. That was the whole point of the Mad Hatter. And when Alice asked the question, where should I go? He said, where do you want to be? She said, I don't know. He said, well, any road will get you there. So you absolutely have to have a set of organizational goals, and org structure is the thing that helps you to get there, but only partially. I mean, org structure is a man-made concept in which we think this is the best way to organize our work. One of the things that I've learned as I've studied and worked on my black belt in systems process, organizational systems process, is that you need to be clear how stuff actually gets done, and the org structure sometimes gets in the way of that rather than supporting it. So yeah, I like the idea of an appropriate org structure, but org structure is something that generally is put into place, in my view, prematurely. It's sort of like, you know, my daughter just bought a house, and I told her not to put anything away in the kitchen until she starts using the kitchen. Then she will know where to put stuff. Sometimes org structures are the same way. Let's start doing the work, and then we'll figure out what the appropriate org structure ought to look like. Now, that may seem like a little over the top, but that's sort of the thought process that I would apply there. Okay. What are some industry groups you would recommend as resource for OD and OCM related information? Any particular books? Actually, I did jot some of those things down, and what I've got to do is find them. Okay, the industry group I've already talked about. That's the OD network. I would say go out on the web and just Google organization or OD network. And you can go in and you can get information and material from them. If you want to join, it's a terrific organization. I think student not that expensive for a year's membership, but they have a lot of free stuff out there, so you can do that. Books. Some of my favorite books: Fifth Discipline by Senge, Good to Great by Jim Collins. One that you might have trouble finding, but is one of my most favorite books. It's a little thin book called Changing the Essence by Dick Beckard and Wendy Pritchard. And it was written, Dick wrote it just before he passed away, a couple of years before he passed away, and he wrote it specifically as almost as a letter to CEOs about how to create change in their organizations. And so he did it almost as a guide for creating, and that's the essence of the name, changing the essence. If you want to change the essence of your organization, here are some things that you might want to consider and approaches to doing it. And I think he did a really nice job and I use that book a lot when I'm thinking through change issues with clients. those are my three. I'm sure, and I'm sure there are others that are out there that are very good. You know, I would suggest that you just sort of read for the fun of it. Just grab one, go out online, take a look at what folks are saying about the book, and read it. I mean, and there are a lot of good little books like Who Moved My Cheese and all those things that you've seen in the past that are quick and dirty, that are fun to read. One called one that I really liked that I read years and years ago by Elihu Goldratt. It's called The Goal. It's really the GOAL, The Goal. It's actually written as a novel in which an organization is trying to create some major changes. So that's a good one too. Okay, Erica, let's see. How did I get started? Well, I think I talked about that. How did I find out about the field? Well, it found me. Didn't exist when I started. I'm sort of like the guy who got in a dinghy and all of a sudden boats started to be built. What was the most challenging consulting project you've had, and how did I resolve it? Let me see if I can do this in 30 seconds. An organization was about to be literally shut down by the federal government because they were the worst in 48 out of 48 organizations doing this work. They were the last in all measures. I mean, it was awful. They were literally awful. 18 months later, they were first in the nation. How did that happen? High involvement by the senior executives in the organization, including things like 18-hour days sometimes, or 9 hours in a conference room having a discussion about who the customer was. This is an organization, I did this work in the mid-90s. This was an organization that had been in business since the mid-60s. So they had 30 years of history, and they were arguing and having a literal debate over who the customer was. It was that level, that level of effort. We engaged and involved every level of the organization. How did we resolve it? We had a team of consultants, some internal, a couple of external. We basically took a look at all of the systems, took a look at the way we looked at it. But the most important thing we did is we changed the mindset of the organization. And at some point, if you want to call me or something, I'll be glad to give you. I mean, it took us 18 months of just heavy work and involvement from about 3,000 people in the organization, because we literally went down to the frontline folks to elicit change initiatives that needed to happen. So, and it was probably the most fun I've ever had in a project, because everybody was engaged and involved, and it was led. I mean, we literally had the CEO teaching courses to frontline supervisors. So it was that kind of thing. What percentage of organizations today would you estimate have a formal OD function? Very few. Formal OD is not. There was in the 80s and early 90s. It was on the rise. It dropped dramatically over the last 10 years. It's coming back now, but I would think. I would say, you know, I'm sure it's less than 20% of formal organizations. First of all, it's very expensive. What most folks do is they rent them. They rent us. That's why folks like Catherine and I exist. They can rent us for a project, and they don't have to keep us on staff. Do you have any experience selling the 7 transformations of leadership? Again, I would suggest that we don't sell that. And that particular model, I actually took a look at it, and this is really more of an HPI, individual leadership development coaching map. I think it would be really helpful for folks who are leadership coaches, who are folks who are working at the individual level, because as I see the 7 transformations, Kristen, the idea is that you use this as a model to do your self-evaluation and self-development. And I tend to be non-denominational when it comes to these sort of things. And if it works for you, terrific, because it gives you a model and a map to do that. So, okay. Let's move quickly here because we've got to get to, do you have experience selling and so on? We did that. How do I deal with unrealistic, all expectations are unrealistic. They always want quick fixes. They want a training solution or everything's going to get fixed in a 1-hour team building session. And my most famous discussion about, or my most, yeah, I guess it's famous. I guess I've told them enough times. The question that I ask leaders when we meet is, when we're all done doing the assessment and we find out that it's you, what do we do? Because I think sometimes we find that clients want folks like myself and Catherine and others to come in and fix all those people around them, and many times the issue really sits right in front of them in the mirror every morning when they're getting ready to come to work. And that's often a difficult discussion. That's often a very difficult discussion. I found that if you can get past that discussion, generally everything else goes a whole lot easier because now they've stopped looking at everybody, them, they, and those, and they start looking at us, and they start looking at the systems, and then you're able to introduce the whole process of improvement. But unrealistic expectations, I think, are, it's sort of like, when I go to buy a new car, I always have unrealistic expectations that I can afford more than I really can. So I think that's you just sort of go in knowing that they're going to be unrealistic. How do I see it changing? I think it's constantly evolving. I think it's what we're going to see more of now. I think is the whole idea of the social media and how folks who are coming into the organization tend to communicate. I talked to you earlier about communication. I think that the whole methodology we use for communicating inside of organizations is morphing. I think it's going to be important for OD folks to understand how folks now communicate, how social media drives that, how texting and emailing has taken the place of sitting down and having a discussion in a lot of places. The whole idea of I think one of the big issues that a lot of my friends are working with, and I'm doing some, are things like this, where we've got remote folks who are on a team who some are in India and some are in California and some are in Chicago and some are in South Africa, and you've got to figure out a way to help those folks work effectively together. I think that's a trend that folks are going to be having to look for. Are there leadership? What would be the defining difference between we talked about that, I think. Are there leadership styles that tend to work better for performance improvement? I think leadership styles that are engaging, that want folks' input, that want folks' ideas, that want people to be a part of creating their own future, those are the people who get stuff done. They're the leadership styles that I think work. Okay. Brian says, company has formalized OD departments, however, it is relatively new. How long do you think it takes for formalized OD effort to gain traction and show results? My reaction to that, Brian, is that it's a function of the leadership and the practitioners. If the leadership wants to really get stuff going and you've got good practitioners in place who know their stuff, you can get a pretty quick start. If leadership is dragging their feet, they really don't want to make any changes, they just want to check the box and say they've got OD stuff going on and they want people to go out and fix them, they, and those, it could take forever, and in some cases nothing gets done. It just muddies the water. So I think it's really now the other way to answer that is that most major change initiatives take a minimum of 18 months, but usually we talk about 3 to 5 years to get any kind of real organizational, cultural changes in an organization. Do I find it challenging to shift the focus of organizational leaders who may be more focused on driving? Oh, absolutely. That's sort of a yeah. It's terribly challenging because they tend to be short-sighted and they want it done now. That's how many of them got to be where they are. They got stuff done quickly. And when you talk to them, I mean, one of the big things that I spend a lot of time doing is trying to slow them down so that they can let the organization catch up to them. So that's seems that leadership, Matthew says, it seems that leadership management process and their ability to communicate the organization's values lie at the core of various models. Absolutely. You find these areas to be ones that require the most careful attention when implementing. These are key, but the value of the model is that they force attention on all the other systems, Matthew. I think that's it's absolutely key to have, but I think that the model, as we said earlier, the value of the model is that it makes you pay attention to all of the other things. Where do I start if I wish to implement an OD program? Are there common pitfalls? And absolutely. Let me start by saying, and sort of finish by saying, I apologize for running over. As an OD practitioner, you only have ideas and approaches to offer. The only thing you have to sell as an OD practitioner is an idea. So you've got to start with the assessment, start small, start where you have friends if you want to get started in an OD. OD tends to tip the cart. It tends to create change. It tends to make people uncomfortable sometimes. So you need to start in a place where you've got that high cover from some leader somewhere in the organization. And so if you're working at a branch level, the branch chief has got to be your high cover. If you're working at a division level or you're working at a department level, you need to sort of start where that high cover is. And then, Catrice, how does the OD model work within bigger organizations? The same. It's just scalable. It works the same. It's just scalable. And what are some of the main issues when implementing this model or a model? Acceptance and patience. I think the biggest thing that I deal with and have dealt with for the last nearly 40 years is just the acceptance and helping folks to let go of what they know, and then having the patience to let the new concepts and give them a try and figure out how they work. I found it's intriguing. It's sort of like that, I think we all have experienced where we've had to learn something new, and then we get really good at it, and then something else comes along, and we fight to learn the new, but once we do, we can't remember how we used to do it in the old days, and if we tried to go back to the old way, we'd have just as much fight. So it's that whole idea of acceptance and patience. So I apologize for being late. Anything else for the good of the order? And Catherine, anything to wrap up? I apologize for holding folks.
Gary, I just want to thank you for addressing everybody's questions. I think that is terrific. It's a really lovely way to wrap up our in-person sessions together. So I want to thank you. It's nice to hear your voice again. I didn't say this at the beginning of the webinar, but Gary and I worked very closely together on a year-long project. We worked on a project at the National Park Service where we were building a second-level leadership program, and we were pretty much connected at the hip virtually. He was in Florida, I was here in Silver Spring, and we were working with a group that was in West Virginia and DC, and we spoke to them a couple days a week. And it was a real joy. I'm excited that he was able to share with you some of the OD models that he uses as an HPI person. I really appreciated having Gary as my counterpart, because as I would be anticipating or wanting to propose things to the client, Gary would be looking through it through that OD lens, and it was really helpful. So as you find yourself evolving your practice, both HPI and OD, having a partner that does have experience in organizational development can help you, because as ISDs we are bringing about change too. It's systematic, so having somebody who has that knowledge of organizations helps to improve the effectiveness of that. So I want to thank you all. I don't want to keep everyone any longer. It's our last session. It's been wonderful meeting virtually. I appreciate everyone's engagement. It's funny, this semester I decided to make the webinars optional, and we got more participation as a result of that. So thank you all, and I look forward to connecting with you all online and wrapping up the semester. So Gary, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Catherine, if I could say one thing to everybody on the line. Catherine, you know how to reach me. I just shared recently, folks, that I'm sort of in the early stages of semi-retirement, and I've got more time on my hands than I used to. So what I'm about to say is, if you have any questions, or Catherine knows how to reach me, please don't hesitate to send me a note, or if you want to call, I'd be happy to have a conversation. Just make sure you have a lot of time on your hands when you call.
Yeah.
So I just want to make that offer. If anybody wants to, I'd be happy to have a conversation online or in person, and it would not be an imposition at all. So I just want to make that offer.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That's very generous. Everyone, thank you. And I guess at this time I know we're over. So if we can say our thanks and goodbyes.
Okay. Thank you.